Hey guys, I just built a Game Room Solutions arcade cabinet. Great machine, great company, great service from Ryan. I wanted to share a few things that I did after the build. So the first thing I did was put the Raspberry Pi in a nice case. It had two heat sinks on top, one on bottom, and it had a 5-volt fan running. One of the things that I noticed is clicking through the different videos here is a little bit of a lag in response in loading the videos, and so doing some overclocking, which I'll talk about in a second, was helped that quite a bit. So I wanted to make sure I had a fan and coolers on the Pi there. The other thing I did was some power management. So one thing you don't want to do is to pull the plug or flip the power switch without actually doing a proper shutdown. As you know, you go to Hyperpie setup and then go down to the shutdown or reboot here, which does a safe shutdown. If you don't, eventually you will either corrupt your SD card physically or the files that are on it to the point where it will not reboot. I've done this myself once or twice. Setting this up, I had some moments where I locked myself out of the controls to escape, or something froze up. You could SSH and do the reboot or shutdown. But I actually ended up installing this Momentary Switch here into the Raspberry Pi. So it has two wires for the LED, positive and negative, and then it has two wires for the switch as well. So when the Raspberry Pi boots up, it runs a script that's always looking for this press. And if you press it once, it will run the attract mode shutdown script, which is the same thing that runs when you run shutdown. If you hold it more than 3 seconds, it then runs the reboot script. So I'm going to click this once. And one thing you'll notice is that the marquee light, the speakers, and the button lights went out as well. Those are on a 5-volt relay, which was another modification that was done. So when the Pi goes into sleep mode, it shuts off the power to the amplifier, the LEDs behind the button, and then the LEDs behind the marquee as well. And you can see this light stays on. It's in sleep mode right now. I can click it once more by shorting pin number 5. I think it's the third one from the top left of the Raspberry Pi, and then with ground it will actually reboot it. So now we're powering back up, and then once the load process gets to that script, it actually triggers the relays to occur, turns on the speakers, turns on the marquee LEDs, then turns on the button LEDs. So I'll show you how some of these were set up. Alright guys, let's take a look at how all of that was put together. Just a little bit of a disclaimer, I'm not an expert in any of the stuff that you're about to see, but I was able to hack together a few solutions, so make sure all the information I'm about to give you is not going to blow up your Raspberry Pi or start a fire, so please check everything and do so at your own risk. I did mention that I did corrupt my SD card. The files on the card, not the physical card itself. And I was able to recover some of the information by first taking an image of the SD card using Win32 Disk Imager in Windows, and then using Disk Internal's Linux reader to read that image and to pull off the necessary files. So those locations, so if we SSH into the Raspberry Pi, those locations of the config files, BIOS, and ROM files are at opt retropie configs. You'll want to back that folder up. Also, home pi retropie ROMs, and then your BIOS files are at the same retropie folder, but in the BIOS folder. So these are the three that I backed up and was able to rebuild a card fairly easily after putting Hyperpie back on that SD card. So looking at the way that the switch reboots or shuts down the Raspberry Pi using a script, I used a base script from a guy named George Illies. I'll put a link in the video description. But if we look at the home folder, Pi, let's see, CD home Pi Pi shutdown is where I placed mine, and I modified his script to in a sense. I used the reboot Pi script from the attract mode down here, and also the shutdown script. And I actually wanted mine to shut down when I did a short press, and then it reboots after 3 seconds. So that's my preference. You'll also see that we use pin 5 here. So this is pin 5 that goes to the switch, and this is the shutdown pin. I would use this pin because this pin, if shorted with ground when the Pi is in sleep state, will boot it back up. So it's very important to use this 5th pin here. And then a couple of other things that you'll notice in this script. All of these relays, setting those to low when the machine boots up, and then when it goes to shut down, I set it to high. Those actually toggle this 11, 13, 15 over here, and that's what turns on the relays and turns off the relays for the sound amplifier, the LEDs for the marquee, and the LEDs for the buttons. So I modified the script to do that as well. The next thing, just to go over some of this diagram here, you can see this is a ground at 5 volt in. Each one of these has an GPIO output pin that was mentioned here. This is 3.3 volts, and then this is the ground, and the switch that was mentioned to pin 5 into the ground. Doesn't matter really which ground, but I put it to the ground at number 14 here. And then this is a 5 volt fan on my Raspberry Pi case, which I ran into the 5 volts up top, and then the ground at number 6 here. The next thing, just to show you a little bit of the overclocking. So if I went to the CD boot folder of the Raspberry Pi, there's the config.txt file, and this is where you can do your overclocking or Raspberry Pi config. So there's someone on YouTube that goes by the name of Mad Little Pixel. I'll put a link to this video in the video description as well. But these 6 or 7 lines right here are the lines for the overclocking that was recommended. So as I mentioned, this helps Hyperpie run the videos and the transition between the different ROMs very smooth. So I recommend that probably only after you get a fan, and make sure you have heat sinks installed on your Raspberry Pi. This is the load that runs across this relay here. So when this relay is triggered, it connects this wire, which completes the circuit for this load. So I'll have my 3 different loads set up this exact same way on their own power sources. If you have any questions or concerns about any of the information, post in the comments, and I'll update it or respond as I can. Thanks.